There comes a moment in every person's life when you begin to notice the shift, when the people who once stood beside you suddenly start looking at you differently. They can't quite put it into words, but deep down, something about you makes them uncomfortable. They used to laugh freely in your presence, but now there's hesitation in their smile. They used to celebrate you, but now they observe you with quiet suspicion. Why? Because they feel like you outsmarted them. They feel like you rose beyond what they expected. They feel like somehow you broke out of the box they built for you, and they cannot stand it. When God lifts you, those who once thought they understood your every move become confused. They cannot explain your peace. They cannot explain your strength. They cannot explain your progress. You were not supposed to win. You were not supposed to survive that pain, recover from that betrayal, or rise after they counted you out. But you did, not because of your own strength, but because God became your strategy. God became your guide. God became the unseen power directing your every step. And when God is the one leading you, no one on earth can predict your next move. There are people who sit quietly thinking about how you managed to endure everything that was meant to break you. They whispered lies. They plotted your downfall. They tried to make you look like a fool. And yet here you are, still standing, still blessed, still shining. They are confused because they can't understand how the same person they looked down on now walks with divine confidence. They thought they outsmarted you, but they didn't realize that God was training you in silence. Every time they laughed at you, God was watching. Every time they mocked your small beginnings, God was writing a bigger ending. Every time they thought they won, God was preparing to show His power through you. Let me tell you something powerful. You didn't outsmart them with human wisdom. You outlasted them with divine endurance. You didn't fight with your mouth. You fought with your patience. You didn't need to argue, prove, or explain. You simply kept your focus on God, and God took care of the rest. You see, when God is with you, He gives you a calm that confuses the wicked. He gives you wisdom that looks like mystery to those who underestimate you. He gives you progress that looks like a miracle. They think it's luck, but it's not. It's God's hand on your life. Some of them feel threatened not because you've harmed them, but because your peace reveals their insecurity. Your growth exposes their jealousy. Your silence exposes their guilt. You don't need to say a word. Your blessings speak for you. The way you carry yourself, the way you move forward without revenge, the way you stay humble even when you could boast, it all unsettles those who expected you to fail. They feel like you outsmarted them because your power didn't come from manipulation. It came from obedience to God. When you stopped reacting, they called you cold. When you stopped chasing, they called you arrogant. But they didn't realize that you were no longer operating on their level. You had stepped into a new dimension of understanding where you realize you don't need to fight for validation when you are chosen by God. The wisdom that comes from above doesn't need to announce itself. It just works in silence and produces undeniable results. That's why they are angry. They're angry because your growth cannot be traced. They can't figure out who's helping you. But the truth is, God is your secret helper. You must understand when God decides to favor you, it disturbs those who rely on deception. They see you move without their approval and it threatens their control. They used to think they could manipulate you with flattery or fear, but now you don't respond. You've grown too wise. You've learned that peace is not weakness, it's power under control. You've learned that silence is not surrender, it's spiritual warfare in disguise. You've learned that walking away doesn't mean you lost, it means you've matured. That's why they're uncomfortable. They feel like you outsmarted them because you no longer play their game. But the truth is, you didn't even need to play. God already declared victory before the battle began. You didn't have to scheme, you just had to stay faithful. They tried to trap you, but God turned the trap into training. They tried to embarrass you, but God turned the shame into strength. They tried to block you, but God turned the delay into preparation. And now what they meant for evil has become the very thing that made you wise. That's divine reversal. That's the kind of wisdom that only God can make. There's a kind of wisdom that only pain can produce, the kind that opens your eyes without making you bitter, the kind that makes you pray instead of panic, the kind that teaches you that revenge is small, but elevation is everything. God didn't want you to win by proving them wrong. He wanted you to win by becoming unbothered, because once you stop reacting, you become unstoppable. That's why they can't stand your peace. It's because your calmness is louder than their chaos. They expected drama, but you gave them discipline. They expected tears, but you gave them transformation. They expected your downfall, but God gave you destiny. Listen carefully. The reason they feel like you outsmarted them is because you stopped giving them power over your emotions. You stopped explaining what God was doing in your life. You stopped announcing your every move. You learned the art of letting God reveal what you conceal. You learned the power of divine secrecy. And now they watch your silence and mistake it for mystery. But you know, it's not mystery, it's maturity. It's what happens when you finally trust God enough to let Him speak through your results. You must never apologize for your growth. Never shrink to make others feel comfortable. Never hide your blessings because someone else refuses to heal. When God elevates you, walk boldly. You paid the price in tears, in patience, in sleepless nights, in misunderstood seasons. You carried pain that nobody saw, and you still kept believing. That's why God is rewarding you publicly, because you honored Him privately. The same people who thought you were naive now realize that your faith made you wise. They can't explain it, but they can't deny it either. And now, as your life begins to shine with divine evidence, some people are panicking. They whisper to each other, how did they do it? How did they survive? How did they rise after everything we put them through? They can't find an answer because the answer is invisible. The answer is God. The same God who turned the sea into a pathway, who brings light out of darkness, who hides His chosen ones under His shadow until the right time. You were hidden, but not forgotten. You were silent, but not still. God was developing your wisdom in the background while they were wasting their energy in gossip. When you walk with God, you become unpredictable. Those who rely on manipulation cannot read you. Those who rely on control cannot handle you. Those who rely on lies cannot trap you. Because when your steps are ordered by God, your strategy is divine. You move when God says move, you wait when God says wait, and you speak when God says speak. That's why some people misjudge you. They can't understand how you can be so patient, so calm, and yet so powerful. They call it luck, but it's divine alignment. They call it coincidence, but it's divine timing. They call it mystery, but it's divine intelligence. Let me tell you something. When God decides to promote you, He doesn't ask for permission. He doesn't check with your critics. He doesn't consult your enemies. He simply opens the door that was always meant for you. And when that door opens, those who once blocked your way are forced to watch you walk through it. That's when they start whispering that you've outsmarted them, but you didn't. You just followed God's instructions while they followed their emotions. You stayed disciplined while they stayed distracted. You stayed humble while they stayed proud. And that's why you are where you are. Never underestimate what happens when you keep your heart pure while others play dirty. God sees every act of restraint. God records every silent tear. God measures every hidden pain, and when the time is right, He turns every insult into influence, every betrayal into breakthrough, every delay into divine direction. You might have been the quiet one in the room, but you were the one God was preparing for leadership. That's why they can't figure you out. Because they never expected wisdom to come wrapped in humility. They never expected greatness to come from the one they ignored. They never expected strength to rise from the one they called weak. But God uses the underestimated to demonstrate His power. The very people who thought they were one step ahead are now realizing they never even in the same race. You see, when you move with God, you're not in competition.
you're in purpose. You're not chasing after people, you're following direction. And when you follow divine direction, you automatically surpass those chasing attention. They feel like you outsmarted them because they measure success in noise, but you measure it in peace. They live to impress, but you live to obey. They depend on recognition, but you depend on revelation. And revelation will always outrun reputation. Do not waste your time explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. Your peace is your proof. Your results are your response. Let them talk while you build. Let them guess while you grow. Let them plot while you pray. Because when you move with God, their gossip becomes irrelevant. What they don't know is that their attacks only sharpen your discernment. Every time they tried to humiliate you, you became wiser. Every time they lied, you became stronger. Every time they doubted you, your faith deepened. That's how God works. He turns pain into strategy. They thought you were being silent because you were weak. They didn't realize your silence was the sound of focus. You weren't ignoring them, you were evolving. You weren't avoiding confrontation, you were protecting your peace. You are allowing God to teach you how to move differently. Because when you grow in wisdom, you realize that not every battle deserves your presence. Some things are better handled by divine justice. And trust me, God's justice is perfect. He sees what you don't say. He hears what you don't reveal. He defends what you can't prove. That's why you don't need to fight back, because your silence is a seed that God will harvest in His time. They will feel like you outsmarted them, but you will know the truth. You simply outlasted them. You didn't match their energy, you mastered your peace. You didn't chase approval, you chased purpose. You didn't fight for position, you fought for purity. And now your elevation is exposing their manipulation. Your peace is exposing their chaos. Your wisdom is exposing their games. That's what happens when you let God fight your unseen battles. When God blesses you, it's not always to make you look good. Sometimes it's to make your enemies wake up. He blesses you to silence their lies. He blesses you to remind them that His hand cannot be stopped. He blesses you to prove that obedience is greater than opportunity. So let them feel outsmarted. Let them feel confused. Let them talk. Because while they analyze your moves, God is authoring your next miracle. While they try to figure out how you made it, God is preparing to take you even higher. You were never trying to win against people. You were trying to win within yourself. You were fighting fear, doubt, loneliness, and uncertainty. You were battling voices in your head that said you weren't good enough. But every time you chose to keep going, every time you chose to trust God, even when it didn't make sense, you built a foundation they can't see.
They only see the glory, but they don't know the grind. They see your peace, but they don't know the price. They see your confidence, but they don't know the countless nights you cried asking God to hold you together. They don't understand that your wisdom was born out of wounds. So when they say you outsmarted them, just smile quietly because you know the truth. You didn't outsmart anyone. You simply stopped letting small minds distract a great destiny. You stopped wasting divine energy on temporary people. You stopped explaining a spiritual calling to those who live by opinions. You let God be your teacher, and that's what made the difference. And now, while they're still gossiping, you're glowing. While they're still competing, you're creating. While they're still scheming, you're succeeding. That's the power of walking with God. They can study your actions, but never understand your anointing. They can mimic your steps, but never match your spirit. Because your wisdom didn't come from books or tricks. It came from storms. It came from brokenness. It came from seasons where you had nothing left but God. And in those quiet moments of pain, God filled you with discernment. That's why you can now see through deception with clarity. That's why your spirit feels when something isn't right. That's why your peace has become your shield. You are no longer easy to fool because you have been educated by experience. And hear me, the wisdom that comes from walking through betrayal is priceless. The understanding that comes from heartbreak is powerful.
You begin to recognize that not every connection deserves your energy. Not every opportunity deserves your yes. And not every invitation comes from God. That's not pride, that's discernment. That's what scares people who once manipulated you. They can no longer control you with their words. They can no longer guilt you with their silence. You've learned the sacred art of detachment, letting go without hatred, walking away without bitterness, forgiving without returning. You've entered a higher place, a place where your peace is worth more than people's approval, where your time is precious and your energy is holy. That's why they feel like you outsmarted them, because you finally realized that your destiny doesn't depend on their acceptance. It depends on God's alignment. You no longer run after people. You run after purpose, and purpose will always outlast popularity. Remember this: the most dangerous person in the world is the one who has nothing to prove but everything to protect. You are protecting your peace, your growth, your mind, your heart, and your relationship with God. That's why they're intimidated. They thought you'd come back begging for their validation, but you found peace in solitude. You found joy in quiet progress. You found contentment in simplicity. And now they are watching from a distance, wondering how you're still shining without their support. That's how powerful God is.
He blesses you in front of those who once blocked you. And there will come a day, my friend, when those who once laughed behind your back will bow their heads in quiet reflection, realizing they misjudged the hand of God upon your life. They thought your silence was weakness, but they now see it was strength, wrapped in patience. They thought your calmness was confusion, but it was divine clarity. They thought your isolation meant defeat, but it was God separating you for something greater. You didn't lose people. God removed distractions. You didn't lose status. God replaced it with substance. You didn't lose your way. God redirected your steps into destiny. That's why they feel like you outsmarted them, because God gave you wisdom that doesn't need to argue, only to act. Every time they tried to control your story, God rewrote it. Every time they thought you'd fall, God gave you balance. Every time they said it was over, God whispered, "Not yet." You see, you cannot outsmart someone who walks with divine timing. They may have moved faster, but you moved wiser. They may have spoken louder, but you heard clearer. They may have looked stronger, but you were standing with God. When God stands behind you, no one can truly stand against you. When God teaches you discernment, you begin to see the traps before you step into them. You begin to feel the energy before the words are spoken. You begin to sense the motives behind every smile. That's what spiritual maturity does. It sharpens your perception. And that's what they fear the most, that you can now see through what used to deceive you. People who once thrived on your confusion are disturbed by your clarity. They used to feed on your reactions, but now they starve in your silence. They can't use the same tricks because the old you no longer exists. You've outgrown their manipulation. You've matured beyond their drama. You've learned that your peace is too expensive to be traded for petty attention. That's divine growth. When God elevates your understanding to the point that you no longer need validation to feel valuable, they think you're distant, but you're just guarded. They think you've changed, but you've healed. And healing always looks like mystery to those who benefited from your brokenness. It's not arrogance when you protect your peace. It's alignment with God's wisdom. When you walk with God, you learn that not every voice deserves your response, and not every invitation deserves your attendance. Some people are not enemies, but assignments. They were sent to teach you what not to tolerate. Some situations were not punishment, but preparation. God allowed them to expose your weaknesses so He could build your strength. You had to learn that peace isn't found in control, it's found in surrender. And once you learned to surrender, you stopped explaining, stopped chasing, stopped reacting. That's when the shift happened.
That's when they begin to say you outsmarted them. But the truth is, you simply outgrew their level of chaos. Wisdom doesn't shout, it whispers. It doesn't react, it discerns. It doesn't rush, it waits. And that's what God gave you, wisdom wrapped in quiet power. You now understand that not every argument needs a reply. Not every attack deserves a counterattack, because when God fights for you, the outcome is already decided. He doesn't lose battles. He doesn't need your panic. He needs your patience. He doesn't need your fear. He needs your faith. So while they're wasting energy trying to figure you out, you're conserving energy building what God told you to build. While they gossip, you grow. While they plot, you pray. While they compete, you create. That's what divine elevation looks like. They feel like you outsmarted them because they still think in terms of competition. But you're not competing. You're cultivating. You're nurturing what God placed inside you. You're minding the garden of your purpose while they're chasing the dust of approval. They don't understand that the truly wise don't need to prove anything. They don't understand that the strongest people don't fight for power. They walk in it. Because real power doesn't scream. It manifests. It's seen in your peace, your progress, and your presence. God has made you a living testimony, and that makes those who underestimated you uneasy. They can't argue with your transformation. They can't deny your growth. They can't explain your resilience. So they label you as cunning, clever, manipulative, because labeling you makes them feel safer. But no label can define what God designed. You must remember this truth. When God gives you wisdom, He also gives you silence. When He gives you clarity, He also gives you stillness, because revelation doesn't need reaction. It needs reflection. Every time you held your tongue when you could have spoken, you gained spiritual power. Every time you walked away when you could have fought, you gained elevation. Every time you forgave when you could have retaliated, you invited divine favor. They don't see those moments, but God does. He sees the strength it takes to stay calm when falsely accused. He sees the faith it takes to keep going when misunderstood. He sees the humility it takes to stay kind, disrespected. That's why He continues to raise you higher, because you handled what others would have ruined. Let them feel like you outsmarted them. Let them whisper. Let them wonder. Because the truth is, you didn't win by tricks. You won by trust. You didn't win by playing games. You won by keeping faith. You didn't win by fighting people. You won by fighting your own weakness. That's the real battlefield. Not the gossip, not the rumors, not the betrayal. The real battle is within.
When you master your emotions, you master your world. When you conquer your pride, you invite divine wisdom. When you silence your ego, you amplify your purpose. That's why they can't pull you back into old arguments anymore. You've discovered that peace is not the absence of problems. It's the presence of God in your decisions. There is a moment when God removes your desire to prove anything. That's when you know you stepped into maturity. You realize you don't need to prove you're right. You just need to stay righteous. You don't need to prove you're powerful. You just need to stay peaceful. You don't need to prove you're smart. You just need to stay silent when fools speak. Because silence is not weakness. It's strategy. It's how God conceals His next move. They thought they exposed you, but God was just teaching you how to move in wisdom. They thought you were running out of options, but you were running into divine order. They thought they were removing you from opportunities, but they were actually repositioning you for miracles. You cannot outsmart a person who is guided by revelation, because revelation comes from the unseen, and the unseen always directs the seen. Those who operate on gossip, jealousy, and pride are blind to the movements of God. But those who walk in discernment move like the wind, unseen, unpredictable, unstoppable. That's what makes your growth so unsettling to others. They can't trace it. They can't predict it. They can't explain it. They just know you're not the same person they once knew. You've shifted from reacting to responding, from striving to flowing, from worrying to trusting. And once you reach that level of peace, nothing external can disturb your internal alignment. There's a reason God allowed you to face betrayal. There's a reason He allowed certain people to deceive you. It wasn't to destroy you, it was to teach you the language of discernment.
You learn to read people beyond their words. You learn to see motives beneath smiles. You learned that loyalty is not proven in comfort, but in conflict. Those lessons were costly, but they were necessary. Because now you move differently. You no longer chase acceptance. You observe character. You no longer react to energy. You regulate your own. You no longer cry over closed doors. You thank God for protection. That's divine wisdom when pain becomes education. So don't be surprised when your peace provokes irritation in others. Some people can't stand to see you calm because your calmness exposes their chaos. Your stillness reminds them of their restlessness. Your contentment highlights their insecurity. You don't even have to speak. Your presence preaches. You walk into a room and something shifts. That's not arrogance. That's anointing. It's the glow of someone who's been through storms and came out shining. They feel like you outsmarted them, but really you just survived more than they know.
You went through seasons that broke you into wisdom. You endured betrayal that taught you compassion. You overcame rejection that taught you self-worth. You walked through fire and came out refined. The longer you walk with God, the less you need to explain. You start to realize that some people will never understand the depth of your transformation because they're still stuck in who you used to be. They speak of your past while you're living in your future. They discuss your mistakes while you're building your destiny. They cling to your old version because your new one intimidates them. That's why you must keep walking. Never look back to prove you've changed. The proof is in your peace. The evidence is in your endurance. The testimony is in your transformation. When God elevates you, He does it quietly. There's no announcement, no grand stage, no audience. Suddenly, you just begin to notice that the things which once shook you no longer affect you. You begin to see that what once drained you no longer has access. That's divine promotion. When you outgrow what used to overwhelm you. And while they are still trying to drag you into old conflicts, you're walking into new callings. They feel like you outsmarted them, but the truth is you just stopped entertaining what no longer aligns with your peace. Remember, God never wastes an experience. Every betrayal had a lesson. Every loss had a purpose. Every rejection had direction. He was molding your discernment, strengthening your patience, and sharpening your intuition. You've learned that not all success is visible. Some victories are silent, like sleeping peacefully after being misunderstood or walking away without bitterness. That's the kind of success that cannot be measured by applause. That's the kind of success that comes from God alone. There comes a time, my friend, when you realize that the greatest revenge is not anger, not retaliation, but peace. When you stop explaining, stop defending, and stop reacting, that's when your true power begins to rise. They thought they could play you. They thought they could confuse you, but they didn't know that the very pain they caused were sharpening your discernment. You see, when you walk with God long enough, you stop fighting battles that don't belong to you. You begin to understand that silence is not surrender. It's divine strategy. Because while they talk, God moves. While they scheme, God builds. While they mock, God manifests. And before long, the same mouths that doubted you will be forced to acknowledge that your wisdom was not human. It was divine. They feel like you outsmarted them because they are still living by sight while you live by insight. They move by impulse, but you move by instruction. They chase what's visible, but you trust what's invisible. That's why your moves confuse them.
They can't trace your steps because your directions come from God, not from people. And when you move by divine instruction, every decision becomes precise. Every step becomes powerful. Every delay becomes preparation. God is not late. He's deliberate. Every time you waited, every time you held back, every time you walked away from something that looked good but didn't feel right, that was wisdom in motion. And now those who used to laugh at your caution are amazed at your elevation. They called you fearful when you were just discerning. They called you indecisive when you were just waiting for the right time. They thought you were falling behind, but God was setting the stage. Because sometimes God delays you not to deny you, but to outposition those who are rushing ahead without wisdom.
Let them run. You walk. Because the one who walks with God may arrive late in people's eyes, but always arrives on time and destiny. That's why they feel like you outsmarted them. Because while they were chasing approval, you were following alignment. There is something unexplainable about a person who is guided by peace. You no longer force doors to open. You knock once and leave it to God. You no longer beg for understanding. You speak your truth and move on. You no longer attach your worth to people's response. You know who you are without validation. That kind of peace is frightening to those who still live in fear. They don't understand how you can be calm while everything around you shakes. They don't understand how you can lose people and still remain joyful. They don't understand how you can face setbacks and still walk with your head held high. But that's what happens when your foundation is God. Storms can shake everything else, but they cannot touch what's anchored in faith. And you must understand this. Your growth is not accidental. It's engineered by divine design. Every disappointment was a classroom. Every betrayal was a doorway. Every heartbreak was a purification. God wasn't punishing you, He was promoting you in silence. Because before God gives you wisdom, He gives you wounds. Before He gives you clarity, He gives you confusion. Before He gives you influence, He gives you isolation. And through that process, He strips away everything that doesn't belong until you become the kind of person who can handle the blessing without arrogance, the attention without distraction, in the favor without falling. Now you walk differently. You don't react to every provocation because you've learned that reaction gives power to noise. You've realized that not everything requires your attendance. Not every criticism deserves your correction, and not every opportunity is divine. That's maturity. That's the kind of wisdom God gives when He's preparing you to handle elevation without contamination. They feel like you outsmarted them because you stopped being predictable. They used to know how to push your buttons, how to get a reaction, how to drain your peace.
But now you've learned to smile and walk away. And that confuses them because they can't manipulate what's content. They wanted you to beg, but you learned to believe. They wanted you to fight, but you learned to flow. They wanted you to compete, but you learned to connect with your purpose. That's why they don't understand you anymore. You're no longer chasing people, you're chasing peace. You're no longer desperate for validation, you're grateful for revelation. You're no longer anxious about what's next. You're trusting that what's next is already written. And when you live like that, you become a walking paradox. Calm, yet powerful. Quiet, yet unstoppable. Humble, yet victorious. Some of them will never admit it, but they envy the way you carry yourself. You don't move with fear, you move with faith. You don't depend on people, you depend on God. You don't follow trends, you follow truth. You don't speak to impress, you speak to impact. And that disturbs those who still rely on external validation. They thought they could break your confidence, but all they did was strengthen your connection with God. Every time they tried to destroy your peace, God rebuilt it with something stronger. Every time they threw stones, God turned them into stepping stones. And now, the same ones who once pitied you secretly study you, trying to understand how you turn pain into power and loss into learning. You see, true intelligence is not in outthinking people, it's in outgrowing them. It's in seeing beyond what they see. It's in walking away without needing closure, forgiving without getting an apology, and trusting that every setback is just a setup for something better. That's divine wisdom, the kind that comes only through fire. You learned that the goal is not to prove them wrong, it's to prove God right. The goal is not to be liked, it's to be aligned. The goal is not to win arguments, it's to win peace. And when you start living like that, you don't even need to defend yourself anymore. Your results become your defense. Your peace becomes your argument. Your growth becomes your answer. There will always be people who can't celebrate you because your existence reminds them of their stagnation. You didn't outsmart them. You simply chose evolution while they chose envy. You chose discipline while they chose drama.
You chose prayer while they chose pride. And now they call you lucky because they can't understand how favor works. But favor doesn't come from pleasing people. It comes from pleasing God. When you walk in obedience, doors open that others can't close. When you walk in humility, opportunities find you without chasing. When you walk in faith, even your mistakes turn into miracles. That's why those who thought they could stop you now watch in disbelief. Let them wonder, let them whisper, let them talk. Because while they talk, you are walking toward your next blessing. While they question, you are collecting wisdom. While they doubt, you are deepening your relationship with God. You have nothing to prove and everything to protect. Your peace, your growth, your purpose. And when you guard those things, you become untouchable in spirit, because the most powerful person in any room is the one who doesn't need to dominate.
It's the one who's already in alignment with God's direction. Every time they say you've changed, say, yes, I have. Because you can't stay the same after walking through storms that were meant to destroy you. You can't stay the same after losing what you thought you needed and still surviving. You can't stay the same after watching God replace everything you lost with something better. You are wiser now, softer but stronger, calmer but more powerful, silent but deeply aware. You are the result of God's refining process. And those who once took you lightly now realize they were dealing with someone protected by divine order. So walk boldly. Don't hide your transformation to make others comfortable. Don't dim your light to protect fragile egos. Don't apologize for outgrowing environments that once fit your small self. You didn't outsmart them, you outgrew them. And that's a victory they'll never understand because it's not won by intellect, it's won by surrender. When you surrender to God, He gives you something no one else can imitate: clarity, calm, and confidence rooted in truth. And when they see that light in you, they'll misinterpret it as cunning, as arrogance, as manipulation. But it's not. It's discernment. It's knowing who you are and whose you are. It's knowing that no amount of lies can destroy what God has ordained. It's knowing that no amount of gossip can block what's been promised. It's knowing that no matter who tries to undermine you, the plan still stands. Because what God establishes cannot be undone by envy. Let them say you outsmarted them. It's fine. Because one day, they'll realize you were simply guided by a higher wisdom. They'll understand that the same God who allowed you to be misunderstood also positioned you to be unshakable. They'll understand that the same battles meant to break you became the bridges that elevated you. And when that day comes, your silence will speak louder than any explanation. Because wisdom doesn't shout, it shines. Peace doesn't argue, it endures. Truth doesn't rush, it reveals itself in time. Keep walking in wisdom. Keep moving in peace. Keep trusting in God's timing, because every step you take in alignment becomes a sermon without words. Every calm decision you make preaches louder than any argument. Every act of patience declares to the world that God is your defender, your guide, and your strategist. And when people feel like you outsmarted them, smile, because what you actually did was trust God. And that's what outsmarts every strategy.